Okay, so this case is entitled Dubai Ports Authority, and this is part A of that case. There are two parts to this case, but we're only going to be covering part A for our course. Now, the case actually starts in 1995, July of 1995 to be precise, and the Dubai Ports Authority, the DPA, has actually by this time established itself to be the 14th busiest port in the world, and it's the primary destination for a lot of shipping companies that are going through the Middle East, and it receives over 50% of all the cargo that actually arrives in the Arabian Gulf by sea. Now, this success was obviously because the port was extremely efficient and the customer services that they were offering, which was facilitated by IT, were amazing. So at the time of case A, which is what we are going to be talking about, as I said, there are two parts to this case. The part B actually talks about what they eventually did, but that's not part of our course. So we're just focusing on case A. Mohammed Sharaf, he was the head of the customer services at the Dubai Port Authority. He had just taken responsibility for a new IT initiative that was intended to improve the port, both internally as well as in its dealings with how they're handling the customers. So they were going to replace the whole paper-based system that they had, which involved a lot of paperwork, a lot of record keeping in manual formats about the ship's contents, into a more digitized and more digital friendly information system, which would then convert all of these documents into digital documents as well as along with its transactions. So the current processes were really slow. They were very labor intensive, and there were lots of chances of errors. And those problems actually appeared to get even worse as the kind of work that the port was getting, the kind of traffic that the port was getting was increasing. It was only getting worse. So Sharaf recognized the implementation of this new manifest and document system that he was trying to create, which was their information system. Henceforth, we'll refer to as the MDS, the Manifest and Documentation System. And he realized that the implementation of the system that he was proposing would not be an easy task. It will be a difficult task. But obviously, he realized its importance and he wanted to get it implemented. So the first changeover from a paper-based environment into this new digital environment would actually be pretty complicated because there was no real single digital standard. That was the biggest challenge that Sharaf was facing in the shipping industry. There is no standard. What is meant by that is every single shipping line, every shipping company, every other port that sent its traffic to the Dubai port had different standards for the way that they kept records of various things. Now, the biggest challenge that DPA actually had, the Dubai Port Authority had, was to find a single standard that would work with everybody's systems, and that was very hard to do because there was no set standard in the shipping industry, as I mentioned. Second, since there was no existing commercial information system in the area, since there was none, they would have to write the entire code, the programming code for such an information system themselves. So the DPA's IT team would have to do it themselves. Thirdly, Sharaf and his team were uncertain on how much code they should actually write. Should the MDS system, the Manifest and Documentation System, for example, be just limited to cargo shipped in containers, which was obviously very standardized. There were different kinds of traffic that used to arrive to DPA, as the case mentions. One of them was actually the cargo that was shipped in containers. So that was very standardized. Should they just write the programming code necessary in the MDS for just that? Or should they also handle the variety of different goods that were shipped in bulk through Dubai, right? Through various other shipping lines. So, or should they also handle, or maybe convince the external partners, all the external shipping lines, the importers, the exporters, the agents, and even the port's own customs authority to use the new system eventually, convince them to use that too, so as to create a standardized system across all of these parties. So to prove itself, they had to act that this system would be better. To prove to all these parties that the system would be better, they would first have to show evidence that this would reduce the paperwork that they have to go through right now. So Sharaf and the Dubai Port Authority needed to persuade people to actually move all of their work to the computer, and they had to do this with people back in the day. This is a pretty old case now, in 2003. So they had to do this for all of those parties who were not even interested in using a computer, who've never bothered to use one, and they didn't probably want to use one, and they were all very varied in their needs and all. So how would he force this change? That was the biggest question. Can he force this change? Because he can convince his own port authority, he can probably convince the importers and exporters that are working from within Dubai, but he can't convince other shipping lines. That's not going to be easy. So by the end of this particular case, Sharaf was pretty confident that he could, that he and his team would actually identify the major questions that they need to answer for the project, but they still need a lot of, questions answered. So as I said, there is also the second case, which we won't be talking about, but this is what the first case is supposed to handle. So what exactly does this case actually try and explain to us? What does it actually help us understand? So the Dubai Ports Authority case actually describes a successful IT implementation in an industry with different companies, with different varieties of their needs and different issues and different ways that they handle that data. And such projects are pretty rare, but they do happen in various industries, especially industries that are now moving towards those technologies. So it is even more unusual because it was not led by one of the most powerful players in the worldwide shipping industry, but just by a single port. So that's a very big deal. Usually you would see such projects happening, such implementations happening by, say, an industry leader. But this was happening by a single port, and there are loads of ports across the globe. Yes, Dubai port is an important port, but still they don't command, that much power with all the other ports in the world. Yet they were able to do this. So that's what it is. So companies with great market power can actually overcome these obstacles quite easily, but smaller players and one port in this case, it was very hard for them to do it, yet they did it. So the Dubai Port Authority provides an example of how to complete and then realize the value from an enterprise IT implementation that's not just within one enterprise like the Dubai port itself, but throughout various other companies. So without being able to exert any kind of market power, they were still able to convince them to come on board with this new system. Furthermore, this implementation is in many ways explains to us what the best practices for an industry level IT initiative should be. For instance, it talks about how to appreciate and understand the difficulties involved in an IT-based business process improvement effort that is across different companies. So many, if not several industries actually suffer from a lot of inefficiencies because everyone has their own different standards, their own information system, and there is a lot of intercommunication required within those companies. Yet that's not happening. So during the initial wave of the enthusiasm of the internet, a lot of entrepreneurs started working with IT, but everybody was doing it in their own way. So one of the biggest things that this case helps us understand and appreciate is how something like this can be done throughout multiple companies and get them on board. Secondly, this case also helps us understand to the extent of the different data format problems. Now, one of the things that was identified was the way that different companies handled different pieces of data. So it describes that each shipping line actually uses different documents and different formats within those documents to describe the contents of the ships, and that alone causes a lot of discrepancies. It creates a lot of difficulties because in the current process it was already pretty difficult, managing the way that each shipping line talks about its own content, the way that each shipping line discusses the various ships within its fleet, the way that all of those companies that are sending that stuff actually have all that record written down. Now, doing that manually was hard enough as it is. Now, convincing them to come up in an information system and then getting all that data digitized would be even harder. If you recall, this has all to do with electronic data interchange. That's how you can do this. In this day and age, this is how it's done. Different companies working with each other, sending and receiving information and converting it from one system to another without people being involved. This is done through electronic data interchange. In an earlier case, we even talked about the Rosetta Net, right? So this is essentially similar to that. So the case actually talks about a lot of this problem and its examples. And that's what you have to figure out about. Another aspect that this case talks about is the exploration of the great amount of heterogeneity in IT capability. By that we mean the differences amongst different companies and their ability to handle IT. So the people in the organization that DP actually wants to work with and bring on board with the MDS project have different levels of IT sophistication. Some companies are really good with IT, some companies understand it really well, some companies appreciate it, some companies have the competencies, the HR, even the capital to make it happen, right? But not everyone does. So some have systems that are already IT capable, that are working across various areas across the globe, and their shipping lines and their ships are everywhere in all other ports of the world, and they're doing really well. Others don't even have a computer yet. So it's a huge discrepancy. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the kind of IT capability of all those companies. So as a result, it's going to be very difficult when Sharaf actually proposed this idea of MDS, the manifestation document system, to those companies. Some would be appreciative, but they'll be like, Why would we accept your system? We already have a really better system. We're already far more matured with that technology. Why would we want to resort to a new one? And why would we do it for you? You're just one port. We are a huge shipping line. Our ships go across the globe to various other ports, and they are the ones who listen to us, not the other way around. And there might be other companies who are not into tech at all, and they'll refuse outright because they'll be like, why would we change it from the already working system, which is pretty well done manually? Just because you want to handle less paperwork, why would we get on board? So it would be very difficult. So that's another appreciation that we get out of this case. Also, it gives an example of how to execute an IT-based extra enterprise effort. By extra enterprise, I mean how you would make this enterprise, which was actually going to be implemented just in the Dubai port, would then also connect with others, with other companies and other places, right? So these Dubai Port Authority managers needed to make a lot of decisions that would contribute to the success, or if not, to the failure of the MDS, right? So they worked with other external partners. They needed to realize what they could realistically actually expect to accomplish. They needed to look at what they could convince those partners to do and work with them. So the MDS effort is in many ways a case that can be read to understand how IT implementations that go across different companies, and especially when it's, as I said earlier, led by a company or led by a group of people that aren't even that powerful in that industry, are going to convince everyone else, right? Then it also conveys the importance of the widespread acceptance of this type of information system. So the DPA was trying to bring in MDS because it would speed up the information processes and the information flows. It would reduce errors. It would increase the internal labor productivity and improve efficiency. So the Ports Authority had to devote a lot of resources to the development of the system and its implementation, and then eventually its maintenance. So the managers believed that this would be an effort if the MDS was accepted. If only a few people in this entire system would accept it, if only few shipping lines would accept it, if only a couple of other cargo lines would accept it, it would not really reap the right kind of benefits. Everyone needed to get on board, and the Dubai Port Authority had to bring it. This is essentially a network effect. A system such as this one would be useless if only a couple of players got on board and the rest did not. So however, if the system did not catch on and people didn't like it, the DPA would be in a really bad position, because obviously they had to then would have to maintain both systems, the old manual system and the new digital system as well, because if only half of them got on board, they'll have to manage both systems, and that would even become even more expensive, even more harder. So this is why this is such an important case. Plus, if you recall, there's a document that I have placed in the Dropbox folder called the Process Enabling Information Technology, PEIT. That's basically a model to understand the implementation of such kind of projects. So the DPA case is actually highlights some of the model's elements, including the span of an effort, the autonomy of the involved groups. It actually gives us a framework to understand cases like this. So the span of the effort is pretty large, right? They have to do a lot of work. They have to convince a lot of people to come in, into the system. There's a lot of autonomy in the involved groups. Every company, every shipping line, every ship, every cargo ship, every other port that works with the Dubai port has autonomy. They can decide not to be part of it. The novelty of the IT business processes that actually come with the MDS, so they're not that novel. The processes themselves are not very novel. They're not new things. They're things that the shipping industry has been working on earlier on. But the model suggests that the most likely pitfalls, for this particular scenario, and it also helps us understand how the company or how the DPA could actually counter those problems. So the DPA managed it really well. And the PEIT model, which is available in the Dropbox folder, you can actually open up that document, and it actually talks about the Dubai port, and I'll cover that in a while. So anyways, so this is what this case is all about. This is what it talks about. Now, how did they actually do it? So let's look at the different reasons for the inefficiency of the information flow. So the analysis of the case that we have, we're going to look down at all the problems that they went through. The first one was the inefficiency of information flow. So what was happening? The case actually says that some of the shipping industry's most important information and document flows, and it talks about how the information is flowing, and it highlights that they're very slow, because they're manual, there's a lot of errors happening. So information is not getting into the system, right? This is obviously pretty surprising. When you're reading it, you're like, how could that be? How could this information that is so important for this entire port and for all of these shipping lines and for this huge amounts of cargo, how could they have such a poor information flow? How could this be happening? So one of the reasons why this is happening is because the information flow is all manual, and it's inefficient because it's manual. and because of a lack of any kind of worldwide network for sending digital versions of the same document, because it's all on paper. So there's a lot of information inconsistency, there's a lot of lack of integration with the data. So if all that the company really needs is the internet, you know, and that's all they need to get the manifest and the bill of lading information quickly, then that's it. That should be the case, right? They should just do it with the internet, right? So this argument can be supported by the fact that the shipping lines, which are of course the most powerful players in the industry, and that's said so in the case, probably have not bothered with this. That's why they are not bothered in trying to actually improve this. So they do not have any kind of interest in improving the efficiency of these information systems. They're not interested in making these processes less error prone. They're not interested in at all, you know. So, but if for instance they were told that if they were to actually bring in a new information system, all of this could be solved, they might get on board, right? So the critical manifest information is still on paper, right? So if it becomes digitized, will the shipping lines, who are the most powerful players in this entire industry, will they come on board? And if they do, then that solves our biggest problem. If they come in, the ports themselves will come in, the cargo ships will come in, the port authority will bother, the importers, the exporters, the port managers, everyone will come on board, because the biggest player will be on board. So there are two basic reasons why the manual processes still keep being used. I mean, it boggles the mind. Why would they not just move to a digitized system if it's just about bringing in the internet? So the biggest reason, first, is that everyone has their own formats. For the documents like the bills of lading, the manifests, they don't want to switch. Every shipping line in every shipping company in every port has their own way of doing things. So they don't want to move to anybody else's system. Nobody is willing to move to anybody else's system. Everybody believes their systems are far more efficient, their way of documentation is better. They don't want to switch to another one. And as I said, there's no one big player who could bring in everyone on board. There's no association, there's no industry-wide standard, which is why this is happening. So there is no standard. The other reason is because of the variety of the IT capabilities of all the companies. So there could be a common standard, but then everybody has different levels of IT capability. So they can't do that either. So you need a minimum level of IT capability across the industry to make something like an internet-based information system viable. Otherwise, nobody's going to agree. Then another reason why the information flows are such a problem is because all the companies have their own specific formats. As the case says, most large shipping companies have information systems that generate a bill of lading and manifest information. Now some shipping lines actually send the bill of lading electronically to their partners, but the manifests, even the computer generated ones, are sent manually on paper. They're actually printed, right? The manifests are of course the information about what is stored in a cargo container or in a ship that is being sent by shipping line. A fundamental reason for this is because each company formats these documents differently. So they have to be sent manually. So these data format incompatibilities do not bother the people, because they know how to understand them. You know, they just look at it and they understand it. But doing it through an information system would require you to create a new system to allow two shipping lines or the shipping lines manifests to be directly understandable by an information system that is being run in a port. Right? That needs to be done. So right now the bills of lading are done electronically and they're sent to their partners electronically. That's perfectly fine. But the manifests are actually created by each company separately, printed out, and the people who are handling those manifests, when the port authority receives them, they look at them manually and they understand it. But you can't do that if you want an digitalized information system, and that information system should be able to understand all different kinds of manifests from all of these shipping lines, and that's impossible. So you need to bring them all on a single standard. So that's an issue. So if two or more parties in the shipping industry wanted to start sending manifests from one computer to another, they'll first have to agree on an exact format that they will both follow. So what is the location of, let's say, quantity shipped, right? So if quantity shipped is a field in that manifest, for example, what are the units of measure? If one company measures the quantity shipped in number of units, another measures it in kilograms, another measures it in stacks, another measures it in dozens, how would you keep track of those things? How would that make sense, right? So coming to an agreement with all of this is a very time-consuming process. It can't be done. So it's also complicated by the fact that each party involved in the negotiation would prefer that the other party would adopt their format, not the other way around. Everybody wants their format to be accepted, right? So that they don't have to do all the hard work. So because shifting from one data format to another, think of it this way, imagine it this way. Imagine a shipping line that is originating from the UK. Now they would prefer to have the shipping manifest, for instance, would have the record of all the products, and let's say all of their expiries or whatever, whenever they were actually put on the ship, in a date format that would have the day, month, and the year in that sequence, right? Imagine a shipping line originating from the US. Now they're going to put the month in earlier before the day. That alone is going to cost a lot of money to convert every piece of data. Now the US shipping line would say that the UK shipping line should convert to our method, and vice versa. Take the SI units, right? The metric units. Let's say one shipping line decides to count or whatever sheets they have or some stuff that they have in inches. Another company says we prefer to have our cargo be measured in SI units, that is meters and centimeters instead of inches, right? So those are just small issues. Now imagine all these companies having their own format. So there are a lot of incompatibilities with the data format. Now let's come to the IT sophistication. As I said, there are a lot of differences in the IT infrastructure and the capability of handling IT within the shipping industry amongst all of these companies. So as the case describes, many of the agents and the merchants that the Dubai Port Authority works with don't even have a computer. So is the Dubai Port Authority going to go and train them and give them computers? Why would they do that? And yet at the same time, there are lots of shipping lines that have a lot of technology, and they have technological expertise. So unless everyone is involved in document handling and they are trained about it and they have computers and they're willing to use it, this can't happen. Now let's look at the second problem. The second problem is what is referred to as the history and the persistence of data standard proliferation. So the awareness of this data format incompatibilities is that most industries are facing actually brings us to two questions. How did this happen in the first place? You should be asking yourself, if the shipping industry is all about trade of all of these companies across the globe, how come they didn't decide on a straightforward standard in the beginning? Right? Why didn't they come up with it in the beginning? The answer to that is very weird, right? But it's also straightforward. That this format differences have always existed. Companies have always developed formats for their own things, for their own documents, their invoices, their manifests, their shipping notification, everything according to their needs and the needs of their trading partners and the parties that they are involved with. So they eventually embedded these formats into their own systems. Say for instance, there must have been a time when UK's shipping companies never bothered with the Dubai port, when it didn't even exist, right? So before that they were working fine. Now suddenly Dubai port pops up somewhere in the 70s and 80s, and now they have to work with their format. So the UK shipping line would say, well, we already have our format, we'll keep on using it. But fine, so you're our partners too, we'll incorporate some of your stuff. So this complication caused very different kinds of formats to be created, right? A lot of these formats were built up as time went by, as these companies matured. They kept on changing, they kept on learning new formats. So there was no one single standard format. So this lack of standards of format was not just a problem because the documents were used by people, right? It wasn't a problem and it was fine and everybody was going along with it because people would read those documents and humans can understand it easily. They can translate from one system to another. There is no single native format that they need to worry about. So data format incompatibilities became an issue when people wanted to involve IT here. When they wanted to have electronic document, that's when this became an issue. So this discrepancy was part of the system and they were fine with it because every company had their own way of doing things. Think of it like languages, like spoken languages. Every culture has their own languages. Nobody was bothered about having a single language, right? Nobody cared about that. Everybody was fine. When different cultures intermingled, they absorbed each other's portions of languages. It was only when we started to have computerized ways of translation that we realized that we needed to find a common way to understand languages. Until then, that was not an issue. Imagine another way. Chinese or Japanese and several other languages cannot really be typed on a keyboard that easily. Why? Because the standards were made by the US, right? The IBM compatible keyboards had English formats and Roman typed formats. So the Chinese language formats and the Japanese and several other Far Eastern languages and even Arabic and all, they had to come up with similar standards. Otherwise, they could not be typed on a computer. So it's similar to that concept. So then the question arises, where would these common formats actually come from? So we've discussed this earlier as well, and I'll talk about it again. It would happen by bringing all of these trading partners, all of these different groups into a negotiation. Another method could be to do an industry-wide consortium and ask them to create this format. Say for instance, similar to what I talked about earlier, like the Rosetta Net, which is a standardization of the way the document is sent and received between different high-tech companies in the entire world. So Rosetta Net is an EDI, an electronic data interchange standard that is used in the high-tech industry. So similar to that, there needs to be some kind of e-documents format for the shipping industry. So maybe even higher level, maybe the United Nations could get involved and help the multinational groups that are involved come up with a better way to have a proposed format that is standardized, like the SI unit system, like the weighing method that we have, the measurements systems that we have, that is standardized across the globe, right? So a significant problem with industry level and international standard setting bodies is that they don't have enforcement powers. They can't force someone to do it. So if one world major shipping line would decide that they would, for example, want to modify the United Nations proposed bill of lading and use a different standard, nobody can stop them, right? So even if the UN has their own methods, it'll be like, yeah, fine, but we'll still have our own methods. So as the case actually described, most of the large shipping lines have done exactly this. They've taken, even at the time of the case, they've actually used modified versions of the United Nations own electronic data interchange standards to communicate with their partners. So they've changed the formats because it felt like more important to them. They're like, we'll change it, we'll modify it for our needs. So nobody can enforce these new standards. They can't force everyone to use those standards. There's no real way to do that. So that could be a problem. So it is the DPA's responsibility to manage this incompatibility among these transmissions. It was up to them. So there's been a lot of, if you were to look at the time period we have right now in this day and age, another way to do this would be through XML. In fact, that is the probable solution if this was happening in this day and age. XML, or extensible markup language, allows you to, on the fly, during real time, convert documents and actually define their formats between different systems. So that can work. XML can work. Another area that the case actually refers to or talks about suggestion is the semantic web. So we could have an internet or a like situation or a network that would be based on meanings. I can't go into the technical details of it, but that's what it would be, based on meanings. But back in the day, it was a big deal. Now, of course, it's a common stuff that happens all the time. Now let's look at the third problem, which is the incentives, the perspectives, and the capabilities of different players in this system. One way to assess the chances for success with a project like the MDS implementation is to look at all the parties who will need to be involved with it and understand their viewpoints. Will they be accepting of the MDS? What concerns will they have? What are the incentives for them to participate into this new system? How much power do they have in the industry? So large shipping lines, as we talked earlier, have very powerful systems, information systems, and they have their own formats like the bills of lading and manifest. They will very likely be unwilling to incur new costs of introducing these new formats and converting all of their data there just to make the shipping industry work better. Why would they bother? They already have their own systems. They won't bother. So this is partly because the line themselves do not bear the cost of poor information flows. The lines don't have to care. They don't have to suffer because of these paperworks and everything. So resolving these kinds of issues is not their issue. It's not their problem. This is the responsibility of the agents and the port authorities. The shipping lines become aware of these problems where they become so severe that shipping and shipments are delayed. Otherwise, they don't care. Small shipping lines can obviously already do this work manually, so they don't want to bother with information systems. So as a result, they would just be, why would we bother with automation? That would be too expensive for us. They don't want to get involved either. So Dubai-based agents, on the other hand, work on behalf of shipping lines, and they're responsible for facilitating these flows of both goods and documents. So these agents are very important players in the industry, but even they are not powerful enough to convince the lines, and because to actually come on board with this system, because these shipping lines change their agents. They can change their agents. They are the bigger ones. They have more bargaining power. So the agents don't have enough power to convince the shipping lines to be part of this MDS. The agents in general are obviously also not technically, savvy. They don't understand these technicalities and issues. So they rely on their manpower and not technicality to resolve any kind of issues and to make transactions happen, right? So they might welcome an effort into an automated system because it eases their jobs. On the other hand, they might even resist it because they don't want to learn new IT skills. The merchants are not directly involved in the process of sending and shipping, sending any kind of shipping documents or clearing the goods at all once they arrive in the port. So they won't even be bothered. They don't even know about the MDS. They're not even involved. So they will be fine either way. They'll be like, as long as the goods come in more quickly, if a system will help do that, cool, we'll be part of it. So the DPA's internal departments, such as the documentation, the statistics and operation, would be very happy with the MDS because this would save them a lot of work, a lot of paperwork, and improve their efficiencies, right? However, there'd be some employees who would be like, if this happens, if the documentation is done automatically and done through information system, we might just lose our jobs because there's no need for paper handling in that anymore, right? And a lot of us will lose our jobs. So the Dubai Customs is at this time of the case a separate organization from the Dubai Port Authority, right? And it has its own business processes that make use of ships manifests. So the MDS project will change these processes as well. And the custom is unlikely to be happy about that. They don't want to be coming under the control of the DPS, right? They won't be happy that the DPS, the Dubai Port Authority system, would actually bring in this new system. They won't be happy with it. So the customs, the Dubai Customs, would not be happy with this MDS giving more power to the Dubai Port Authority and actually convincing them to be part of it. They won't be happy either. So now we need to look at the critical elements of the Dubai Port Authority's rollout success. What exactly would be the elements that would make it successful, right? Let's look at those. So the critical elements of DPS rollout success would be, once we've analyzed all the motivations of all the players, their incentives to whether they would join the MDS project or not, it seems to indicate that it will be pretty difficult. It will not be easy for it to be successful because there's so many elements involved, right? So how did the DPM make this project work? How did a single port, a single seaport, standardize information formats and flows in this complicated environment? So a large part of an answer to this question is that the DPA did not attempt to change the information system flows or formats or business process throughout the industry. In fact, many players were actually asked to make no changes at all. You know what they did was DPA changed its internal practices, and through persuasion those of its sister custom organization. This was discussed in the case B, and as I said, case B is not part of your course, but just so you understand what they did. So, and the channels through which it received much of the information. So it also asked the local agents to submit documents digitally rather than manually. Other players, however, were not affected by the MDS project at all. The merchants and load agents, right, were unaware that the project was even happening because they weren't even involved, and the shipping lines were only aware to the extent that they had to grant DPA the permission to integrate the DPS system with their systems. That's it. For MDS, the principal external partners were the discharge agents who were actually responsible for submitting the manifest to the port and the customs. And as it was discussed in case A, there were important differences among those agents as well. But there was also a similarity. All these discharge agents were actually based in Dubai. So the integration would not have to go along across the world. It could just be done with these agents who are already residing in Dubai and operating out of Dubai. The MDS team could work with the entire local group. They could work with the local group and which is well known to the DPA, and they could help with the integration efforts. So this is what they did. So as the case B, which again is not part of the course, and I'm telling you what they did just to understand how they solved this problem. It describes that the initial integration project was intelligently structured in several ways. First, the MDS team actually worked only with agents who represented large shipping lines. These agents were obviously technically sophisticated and aware because they were working with large shipping lines who were technologically savvy, and since obviously they were the ones who did most business with DPS. Second, the integration project did not require the agents to bear any kind of costs. And finally, the process of generating and transmitting the electronic manifest was designed to be as simple as it could be, so as to reduce the workload. The interface to each agent's information system was created by the MDS, and this did as much of the work as possible to automate the creation of all the manifests. The agents were asked to manually enter only information that could not actually be taken out automatically. For them, generating and submitting e-manifest was actually faster and easier than they had to earlier with a paper. And since they were paid a flat salary, they didn't have to worry about how much less or more work they had to put in, right? That's already mentioned in the case too. So they were happy with doing lesser work and still getting paid the same amount. So this solution actually addressed the problem of data being different across the entire industry, heterogeneity of the data in the shipping industry in a local way. It was only done in a localized area and only in Dubai, but it was still effective. The DPA did not propose or force any acceptance of this e-manifest standard for the entire industry. It didn't even or even ask various other parties to work with them. Instead, the MDS team defined its internal standard and then took on the task of converting all the formats to this new standard way so as to be less invasive and less persuasive of these external parties, so as to not anger them, right? And while the initial MDS system did not require the agents to manually enter this information, this was actually much less work. This was much less work than would have been required to submit a paper manifest, right? So the entry using these digital systems by the agents was actually simpler and easier, so they were happy with it. So securing the participation of the customs was a difficult process. because without the customs being on board, they would have to make double submissions because the customs was still working on paper, right? So in this case, they had to bring the customs on board. Also, the shipping lines would have been much more reluctant to share their transshipment information. To remind you again, transshipment is basically when the Dubai port is just used as a transit, there where the shipment would actually move even further away from the Dubai port to another port, right? It's just a transit port. So only the customs was entitled by UAE law to see this information, right? So they had to bring the customs on board. So all the shipping lines that were using the Dubai port as a transit port would actually fall in the jurisdiction of the customs. So the MDS had to bring the customs on board, otherwise it wouldn't have worked, right? So this continued, this rollout continued. The MDS system provided answers to a lot of questions that were raised in A cases, as well as the ones that are in B, and I'm not referring to B, I'm just telling you the solution that they came up with, and they worked it out. So DPA did not force any agents to submit digital manifests. The Ports Authority did, however, announce that the digital manifests would be cost free, they would be submitted for free, while paper would be costing money. So this was an incentive. Now they would want to switch to the digital one because they would otherwise have to incur the processing fees of the physical paper, right? So this surcharge also, this extra fee was not widely applied, but just because it was there, a lot of agents started to move towards the digital methodology. So by the time of the second case, right, the government of Dubai decided to merge the DPA and customs into a single organization, and that solved a lot of the problems. But that still doesn't happen in most of the ports in the world, but it happened in Dubai's case. So this meant the customs objections were gone because now they were part of the same group and they had to move to the MDS project. And the ports of Dubai continued to be grow over time, and it was pretty successful. And Mohammed Sharaf and the other DPA managers believe that the DPA is an excellent example of how such a thing can be implemented, and then the MDS system is a proof of the fact that if for any port to run really well, they should do something like this. So that would be very, very helpful for them. So this is pretty much it for this case. There's not much else to discuss about it. This is how they pulled it off, and I hope that you're able to make sense of this, and are able to understand the case better by listening to this audio recording. Thank you.